Nobody believed the old priest when he started screaming in the middle of the council session. The Shimmer holy man had burst through the golden doors of the Galactic Council chamber, his crystalline body flickering with panic. His four arms waved wildly as he projected ancient holographic texts into the air. The symbols were 10,000 years old. Most species had forgotten how to read them. Ambassador Ryla recognized the words immediately. Her species had passed down the stories for generations. The devouring swarm, the endless hunger, the reason the previous galactic civilization no longer existed. The council chamber fell silent. 47 species sat in their designated sections, representing trillions of beings across known space. Most of them had never heard of the swarm. Their worlds were peaceful. Their histories were short. They had evolved on paradise planets with gentle climates and abundant food. War was something they read about in primitive culture studies. Counselor Meth, a massive insectoid being with 6 legs and compound eyes, clicked his mandibles nervously. His species, the Builders, were among the oldest in the galaxy. They knew the truth about the swarm. They had reasons to stay quiet about it. The evidence came within the hour. Long-range sensors detected movement in the outer rim. Something vast was awakening in the dead zones. The regions of space where no life existed because something had consumed it all millennia ago. Ryla stood before the council and pleaded for action. Her voice echoed through the chamber as she described what the ancient records showed. The swarm did not negotiate. It did not stop. It fed on organic matter, on planets, on entire star systems. The previous galactic civilization had numbered in the quadrillions. The swarm had left nothing behind but empty rocks and silence. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were diplomats and traders, scientists and artists. None of them knew how to fight. Their security forces handled minor disputes and criminal matters. They had no armies. They had no weapons capable of stopping a threat like this. A small voice spoke from the back of the chamber. Doctor Sarah Bell was a junior diplomat from Earth, a world that had only joined the galactic community 200 years ago. She was short by human standards, with dark skin and gray hair pulled back in a simple knot. Most council members did not know her name. Humans were considered a curiosity, nothing more. She suggested contacting Earth for military assistance. The laughter started almost immediately. The Valori representative, a being made of living gas, expressed amusement at the idea. Humans came from a category 7 Deathworld, the most dangerous classification possible. Their planet had earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, and apex predators. Their own star bombarded them with radiation that caused cellular damage. The fact that humans had survived at all was considered a statistical miracle. The fact that they had developed intelligence was treated as a cosmic joke. How could such primitive creatures possibly help against the swarm? Sarah did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with aliens about human capabilities was pointless. They would not believe her until they saw it for themselves. The session ended with no resolution. The council formed a committee to study the problem. They scheduled follow-up meetings. They drafted preliminary reports. They did what bureaucrats always do when faced with problems too large to comprehend. That night, the first colony world fell. Shimmer Prime was a peaceful planet of 3 billion beings. They were artists and philosophers, gentle souls who had never known violence. When the swarm arrived, they tried to communicate. They broadcast messages of peace and welcome. They offered to share their resources. The swarm did not respond with words. It responded with hunger. The bioships descended like a plague of locusts. Each one was a living creature the size of a mountain, filled with billions of smaller organisms that stripped everything organic from the surface. Buildings made of crystal were ignored. Bodies were not. The distress calls lasted for 6 hours. Council members across the galaxy watched the footage in horror. They saw families running through streets that dissolved beneath their feet. They saw children crying for parents who had already been consumed. They saw an entire civilization vanish in less than a day. When the swarm finished with Shimmer Prime, it moved on. It did not rest. It did not slow down. It simply continued toward the next inhabited world. Ryla stood in her quarters aboard Station Harmony and wept. Her homeworld was not Shimmer Prime, but her people had founded that colony. Those were her cousins, her friends, her students from the academy. 3 billion lives, gone in hours. Her communication panel lit up. An incoming message from Earth. Admiral Diana Reyes appeared on the screen. She was an older human woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much death. She spoke in simple, direct terms. Earth had received the distress call. Earth had seen the footage. Earth was coming. Ryla wanted to feel hope, but she could not. She had studied humans. She knew they were tough, adaptable, and surprisingly clever. But the swarm had destroyed civilizations that spanned thousands of worlds. What could one small species from a forgotten death world possibly do against that? She thanked the Admiral and ended the call to eye in the darkness of space. The swarm continued its advance. It had no thoughts, no plans, no desires beyond consumption. It simply was, and everything else would soon not be. But somewhere in the distance, 50,000 humans were loading onto transport ships. They were soldiers from a world that had tried to kill them since the moment life began. They were survivors of earthquakes and plagues, wars and famines. They were the children of a planet that showed no mercy. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the swarm was about to meet something that would not run. Itch of the voice. You can even tweak the SML, speech synthesis markup language, to control how the different sections of the text sound. Click on SSML above to give it a try. Enjoy using text-to-speech. The recruitment office in Lagos had run out of chairs 3 hours ago. Sergeant Benny Okafor watched the line stretch around the block and smiled. He had grown up in this city during the water wars, when armed gangs fought over access to clean rivers. He had buried friends before his 15th birthday. He had learned to build weapons from scrap metal and defensive walls from rubble. When the African Restoration finally brought peace, he joined the military because fighting was the only skill he had. Now the galaxy needed fighters. He signed his paperwork and joined the thousands of other volunteers streaming toward the transport ships. The news feeds showed the same footage on every screen. Shimmer Prime burning. 3 billion dead. An enemy that could not be reasoned with, could not be stopped, could not be understood. Benny understood it just fine. The swarm was a predator. Earth had plenty of those. Across the world, similar scenes played out. In the highlands of Peru, a young medic named Ana Ruiz closed her village clinic and reported for duty. Her ancestors had survived at altitudes that would kill most humans. Thin air, freezing temperatures, and isolation had made her people tough in ways that lowered elevation cultures could not imagine. She had treated frostbite, altitude sickness, and injuries from landslides since she was old enough to hold a bandage. The galaxy needed medics who could work under pressure. Ana had never known any other kind. In Osaka, Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka finished her final training flight and received her orders. Her grandmother had been a rescue pilot during the Great Pacific Typhoons, flying into storms that had killed hundreds of other pilots. Yuki had inherited that same stubborn refusal to accept impossible odds. She had broken 17 flight records in the combined defense forces. She had walked away from crashes that should have killed her. The galaxy needed pilots who were too stubborn to die. Admiral Diana Reyes watched the volunteer numbers climb on her command screen. 50,000 had been the goal. They passed it within hours and kept going. Earth had plenty of people willing to fight for others. That was what humans did. She assembled her command staff and reviewed the tactical data on the swarm. The galactic species had provided everything they knew, which was almost nothing. The swarm had not been seen for 10,000 years. The records were fragmented, incomplete, and mostly consisted of desperate final transmissions from dying civilizations. But Diana noticed something the aliens had missed. The swarm was not random. It moved in patterns. It prioritized certain targets over others. It responded to threats in predictable ways. That meant it could be studied. That meant it could be fought. Her analysts began building models. Her engineers began designing weapons. Her soldiers began training for an enemy no human had ever faced. The fleet launched 3 weeks later. 200 warships carried 50,000 soldiers towards Station Harmony, the central hub of galactic civilization. It would take 6 weeks to arrive. Diana used every moment for preparation. The aliens aboard Station Harmony watched the human fleet approach with a mixture of hope and horror. Ryla stood in the observation deck as the first ships emerged from faster-than-light travel. They were ugly vessels, all angles and armor plating, built for function rather than beauty. They looked like weapons. She boarded the command ship to greet Admiral Reyes personally. What she found disturbed her in ways she could not explain. Human soldiers moved through the corridors with casual efficiency. They laughed and joked with each other, even though they were heading toward almost certain death. They ate food that Ryla's species had classified as toxic. They exercised in gravity that would crush a shimmer body. They discussed previous battles they had survived, previous friends they had lost, previous horrors they had witnessed, and none of it seemed to bother them. Ryla met Sergeant Okafor in the engineering bay. He was teaching a group of soldiers how to improvise explosive devices from common materials. When she asked him if he was afraid, he shrugged. Fear was normal, he said. Everyone felt fear. The trick was doing the job anyway. She met Ana Ruiz in the medical bay. The young woman was practicing surgery techniques while the ship vibrated from engine stress. Her hands never shook. When Ryla asked how she stayed so calm, Ana smiled. "I in her village," she said. "Earthquakes happened during surgeries. You learned to keep cutting or your patient died." She met Yuki Tanaka in the fighter bay. The pilot was checking her spacecraft with obsessive attention to detail. When Ryla asked about the risks of combat flying, Yuki laughed. Her grandmother had flown through hurricanes for 40 years, she said. A few alien monsters were nothing compared to a Category 6 typhoon. Ryla returned to Station Harmony that night and filed her report with the council. Counselor Meth read it in silence, his compound eyes unreadable. The other council members asked questions she could not answer. Were the humans truly capable of fighting the swarm? She did not know. Were they brave or simply insane? She could not tell the difference. Would they make any difference against an enemy that had destroyed entire galaxies? Only time would answer that question. The answer came 3 days later that long-range sensors detected swarm movement. The vast horde of bioships had changed course. Instead of continuing toward the populated core worlds, they were turning. They were heading directly toward the human fleet. Somehow, the swarm had recognized the threat. Admiral Reyes received the report and smiled. "Good," she said. "It saves us the trouble of finding them." The first battle of the war was about to begin. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the swarm was facing an enemy that was actually looking forward to the fight. The acid rain fell in sheets across the mining outpost, dissolving everything it touched. Sergeant Benny Okafor barely noticed. He was too busy setting charges along the asteroid belt's inner ring, preparing a welcome gift for the approaching swarm fleet. The planet below him, Velan 4, had been classified as uninhabitable by galactic standards. Toxic atmosphere, corrosive precipitation, constant seismic activity. The perfect place for a forward operating base. Humans had set up camp in 3 days. The alien observers still could not believe it. Admiral Reyes had chosen this system specifically because no galactic species could survive here. The swarm would expect easy pickings. Instead, they would find 50,000 humans who felt right at home. The first bioships appeared on sensors at dawn. They were enormous living creatures, each one carrying billions of smaller organisms in their hollow bodies. They moved through space like whales swimming through an ocean of stars. Beautiful in a terrible way. Yuki Tanaka launched with the first fighter wave. Her squadron consisted of 20 pilots, all veterans of Earth's various conflicts. They had trained for 6 weeks on combat maneuvers specifically designed for this enemy. The simulations had been brutal. The real thing would be worse. The bioships released their swarms. Millions of smaller creatures poured into space, each one the size of a human fighter craft. They moved with hive intelligence, coordinating perfectly without any visible communication. They had consumed countless civilizations. They expected this battle to end the same way. Yuki pulled her fighter into a spiral dive that generated 15 times Earth's gravity. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Her bones creaked under the pressure. Any galactic pilot would have blacked out or died. She held the maneuver for 30 seconds, emerging behind a cluster of swarm creatures that had no idea she was there. Her weapons tore through them like paper. Across the battlefield, human fighters performed similar feats of physical impossibility. They survived forces that would kill any other species. They flew patterns that defied logical prediction. They refused to retreat even when outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Benny detonated his charges when the main bioship fleet entered the asteroid belt. The gravitational mines created temporary singularities, points of infinite density that tore the living ships apart from the inside. 4 bioships died in the first minute, 8 more in the next 5 minutes. The swarm had never experienced losses like this. Not once in 10,000 years. On the surface of Velan, 4 Ana Ruiz ran the field hospital. Wounded soldiers arrived constantly, carried by their squad mates through the toxic rain. She performed surgery after surgery, ignoring the tremors that shook the ground every few minutes. Earthquakes had been common in her Highland village. She had learned to operate between shakes. A young soldier arrived with both legs crushed by debris. Ana assessed him in seconds and began cutting. No anesthesia left. No time for careful technique. Just fast hands and absolute focus. The soldier screamed, but survived. The galactic observers recorded everything. They had been sent to document the human defeat, to learn what did not work against the swarm. Instead, they found themselves watching something unprecedented. Counselor Meth observed from a shielded position in orbit. His compound eyes tracked the battle data, and his ancient mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The humans were winning. Not easily, not cleanly, but winning. They took casualties and kept fighting. They lost friends and kept fighting. They faced death with a determination that his species had never possessed. The battle lasted 4 days. 4 days of constant combat, constant pressure, constant death. Humans rotated through shifts, grabbing sleep whenever possible, eating rations that would poison most galactic species. They fought until their ammunition ran out, then fought with improvised weapons. They fought until their bodies failed, then fought on willpower alone. When it finally ended, 3,000 humans were dead. 40 swarm bioships had been destroyed, along with billions of smaller creatures. The swarm retreated for the first time in recorded history. Ryla watched the footage from Station Harmony and wept again. But this time, the tears were not from grief. She saw human soldiers carrying their wounded through fire and poison. She saw medics working through injuries that would have killed members of her species. She saw pilots flying suicide missions and somehow surviving. She saw hope. The galactic news networks broadcast the Battle of Velan across known space. Every species watched. Every species learned a new word. Deathworlders, the beings who came from planets that tried to kill them, and who had learned to kill back. Admiral Reyes held a memorial service for the fallen. 3,000 names were read aloud. 3,000 lives honored. The surviving soldiers stood in silence, then returned to their posts. The war was not over. It had barely begun. The celebration was cut short by an intelligence report. Analysis of captured swarm tissue had revealed something disturbing. The creatures were adapting. They were studying human tactics, human biology, human weaknesses. They were not mindless after all, and they had identified a new target, Earth. The swarm had recognized humanity as the only real threat in the galaxy. It was changing course, redirecting its entire force toward the one world that had produced warriors capable of hurting it. Diana Reyes read the report and felt something she had not felt in decades. Fear. Real, honest fear. Not for herself, but for her home, her people, her species. The swarm was coming for Earth, and humanity would have to stop it or die trying. Benny Okafor loaded fresh ammunition. Ana Ruiz restocked her medical supplies. Yuki Tanaka climbed back in her fighter. The real war was about to begin. 2 million people watched the sky turn black. New Brisbane was a young colony, barely 50 years old. The settlers had carved a civilization out of a harsh world. building cities in the shadows of active volcanoes and along coastlines battered by constant storms. They were tough people, descendants of Earth's most stubborn survivors. They had faced every challenge their new planet had thrown at them, but they had never faced the swarm. The bioships appeared at dawn, emerging from faster-than-light travel in a ring around the planet. Within hours, they had established a complete blockade. No ships could enter or leave. No signals could reach the outside world. New Brisbane was alone. Admiral Diana Reyes received the news 6 light-years away. Her fleet was scattered across multiple systems, fighting smaller swarm incursions. Gathering enough ships to break the blockade would take weeks. New Brisbane did not have weeks. She made the call anyway. Every available ship would converge on New Brisbane. They would arrive in 12 days. The colonists would have to survive until then. Sergeant Benny Okafor was already on the surface. His engineering team had been reinforcing the planetary defense grid when the swarm arrived. Now, they were the only military unit standing between 2 million civilians and extinction point 12 soldiers against billions of hungry creatures. The math was impossible. Benny did not care about math. He established defensive positions around the main population centers. He improvised weapons from mining equipment. He trained civilian volunteers in basic combat techniques. When the swarm began landing ground forces, he met them with everything he had. The first wave hit the northern defense line at noon. Swarm creatures poured through a breach in the shield generator, thousands of them swarming toward the refugee shelters. Benny held the gap with 3 soldiers and a handful of explosives. They fought for 6 hours without rest. When reinforcements finally arrived, 9 of his original 12 soldiers were dead. Benny was still standing, covered in alien blood and human bruises. He refused medical treatment and returned to his post. Ana Ruiz organized the civilian shelters. She had established a triage center in an underground bunker complex, away from the heaviest fighting. 400,000 people crowded into spaces designed for 100,000. Disease and panic were constant threats. She moved through the crowds with calm efficiency, treating injuries, distributing supplies, and keeping hope alive. When a section of the bunker collapsed during an earthquake, she led rescue teams through unstable tunnels to reach the trapped survivors. She saved 112 people that day. She lost count of how many she saved over the following 2 weeks. Above the atmosphere, Yuki Tanaka flew mission after mission against the blockade ships. Her fighter had been damaged in the initial attack, barely functional. She flew anyway. The swarm had learned to fear human pilots, but they had not learned to counter Yuki specifically. On the 8th day, her engines failed during a strafing run. She crashed her fighter directly into a swarm command node, a concentrated cluster of creatures that coordinated the ground assault. The explosion destroyed the node and scattered the swarm forces for 6 critical hours. Yuki walked out of the wreckage with 2 broken arms and a concussion. She refused evacuation. She picked up a rifle and joined the ground defense. The galactic observers had expected to watch humans die. Instead, they found themselves joining the fight. Ryla had traveled to New Brisbane aboard a medical supply ship. When the blockade trapped her on the surface, she volunteered for dangerous missions. Her species was fragile by human standards, but she could reach places humans could not. She flew medical supplies through swarm-infested zones, using her ship's small size to avoid detection. But on her 7th run, her ship was hit by swarm fire. She lost 3 of her 4 arms to radiation exposure. She completed the delivery anyway, landing her crippled vessel in a refugee camp with enough medicine to save 3,000 children. When Benny found her bleeding in the cockpit, she smiled. Humans were not the only ones who could be stubborn, she said. Day 12 arrived with the sound of thunder. The relief fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel and immediately engaged the blockade ships. Admiral Reyes led the charge personally, her command ship cutting through swarm formations like a blade. The Battle of New Brisbane lasted another 3 days. When it ended, the swarm was broken. 500,000 humans had died, soldiers and civilians alike. But 2 million had survived. Benny stood among the ruins of the northern defense line, and watched the last bioship burn. He thought about the friends he had lost, the impossible odds he had faced, the moments when death had seemed certain. He thought about the people he had saved, that it was worth it. It was always worth it. Anna treated the wounded Admiral Reyes personally, pulling shrapnel from her shoulder while the older woman dictated orders. The war was not over. Intelligence reports had revealed something terrible. The swarm was not attacking randomly. It had a destination. Deep in the galactic core, hidden in regions of space no living being had visited in 10,000 years, there was something called the origin point. The ancient records were fragmentary, but they suggested the origin point was the key to everything, that if the swarm reached it first, the war was over. Everyone would lose. Diana looked at her battered fleet, her exhausted soldiers, her wounded allies. They had won an impossible victory. Now, they had to do it again, on a scale that made New Brisbane look simple. She gave the order. All ships would pursue the swarm to the galactic core. The final battle was coming. Dead worlds drifted past the observation windows, one after another. Doctor Sarah Bell stood in the command deck of the fleet's lead ship, studying the ruins of civilizations that had thrived 10,000 years ago. Empty cities floated on airless moons. Abandoned space stations hung in orbits around stars that had watched their inhabitants vanish. The swarm had left nothing behind but silence and stone. The combined fleet was 3 weeks into its pursuit of the swarm toward the galactic core. 200 human warships and 500 allied vessels from a dozen species traveled together through regions of space that had been forbidden for millennia. Every day brought new reminders of what failure would mean. Sarah spent her nights translating ancient records recovered from the dead worlds. The previous galactic civilization had been vast and powerful, far more advanced than the current one. They had built wonders that modern species could barely understand. They had thought themselves invincible. The swarm had consumed them in less than a century. But Sarah found something else in the records. References to the origin point, a device at the center of the galaxy that held the key to the swarm's power. The ancient texts were damaged and incomplete, but she pieced together enough to understand the truth. The origin point was not a weapon. It was a cure. She brought her findings to Admiral Reyes and Counselor Meth. The insectoid diplomat listened in silence, his compound eyes revealing nothing. When Sarah finished speaking, he told them the rest of the story. 10,000 years ago, the swarm had been a peaceful species. They were called the Harmonious, a civilization of artists and philosophers who communicated through biological song. They had been friends of the builders, partners in exploration and discovery. Then a plague struck them, a disease that rewrote their biology and turned them into mindless consumers. The builders had created the plague. It was meant to be a weapon against a common enemy, but it escaped containment. It infected the Harmonious and transformed them into the swarm. The builders had spent 10 millennia carrying that guilt, watching the monster they created destroy everything it touched. The origin point was their last attempt to fix their mistake. A device that could reverse the plague and restore the Harmonious to what they had been. But activating it required someone to operate it from inside, and the activation would vaporize anything organic within the control chamber. The previous civilization had tried to use the origin point. They failed because they could not find anyone willing to make the sacrifice. The swarm had overwhelmed them before they could try again. Ryla listened to the story from her medical bed, her remaining arm clutching the sheets. She understood now why Counselor Meth had been so reluctant to speak. His species had caused all of this. Trillions of deaths across thousands of years, all because of one mistake. Meth expected anger. Instead, Ryla reached out and touched his carapace gently. Everyone made mistakes, she said. What mattered was fixing them. The fleet continued its journey. Humans and aliens worked side by side, learning from each other in ways that would have seemed impossible months ago. Benny Okafor taught Shimmer engineers how to improvise repairs using salvage and determination. Ana Ruiz trained alien medics in triage protocols that prioritized saving the most lives rather than following procedures. Yuki Tanaka led mixed-species fighter squadrons through combat drills, pushing alien pilots beyond their physical limits. The aliens learned that humans were not just warriors. They were teachers, healers, and friends. They shared their food, their stories, and their courage. They treated every species as equals, regardless of physical differences or cultural gaps. The humans learned that aliens were not just fragile creatures who needed protection. They had their own strengths, their own wisdom, their own reasons to fight. The Shimmer had once been warriors too, 10,000 years ago. They had sacrificed themselves to put the swarm into dormancy the first time. The current generation had grown up in the shadow of that sacrifice, terrified of war, but honoring those who had fought it. Sarah Bell realized something important during those long weeks of travel. The galaxy did not need humans to save it. The galaxy needed humans to show everyone else how to save themselves. They arrived at the galactic core on the 63rd day. The origin point hung in space before them, a structure the size of a small moon surrounded by billions of stars. It was beautiful and ancient, a monument to civilizations that had risen and fallen while it waited. The swarm was already there. Countless bioships surrounded the origin point, merging with its outer layers. The swarm was feeding on its energy, growing stronger with every passing hour. If they completed the process, the origin point would become a breeding ground. The swarm would multiply without limit, spreading across the galaxy until nothing remained. Admiral Reyes called a council of war. The fleet was outnumbered 1,000 to 1. A direct assault would be suicide. But they had no choice. The only way to stop the swarm was to reach the origin point's control center and activate it manually. That meant fighting through the largest concentration of swarm forces ever recorded, landing a hostile structure the size of a moon, and reaching a chamber that would kill whoever entered it. Volunteers were needed for a mission that could not possibly succeed. Every human in the fleet raised their hand. So did Ryla. So did Counselor Meth. So did representatives from every allied species. The final battle would begin at dawn. Whatever happened next, the galaxy would never be the same. Benny loaded his weapons. Anna prepared her medical kit. Yuki checked her rifle. Sarah uploaded her research to the fleet's database, just in case. Tomorrow, they would save the galaxy or die trying. For humans, that was not a difficult choice. It was simply what they did. 1,000 soldiers dropped through fire and darkness toward the origin point. Sergeant Benny Okafor hit the surface hard, his boots cracking against metal that had not felt footsteps in 10,000 years. Around him, human and alien soldiers landed in formation, immediately spreading out to secure the landing zone. The swarm was everywhere, billions of creatures crawling across the ancient structure like insects on a corpse. The ground assault had begun. Admiral Reyes commanded the space battle from her flagship, drawing the swarm's attention away from the landing teams. Her ships fought and died by the dozens, buying precious minutes for the soldiers below. She watched the casualty reports climb and kept giving orders. There would be time for grief later. If there was a later, Benny led his team through corridors that had been built for species long extinct. The walls pulsed with organic matter where the swarm had begun merging with the structure. Every step brought them closer to the control center. Every step cost lives. Half his team died in the first hour. Swarm creatures poured through the passages in endless waves, driven by something beyond hunger. They knew what the humans were trying to do. They were desperate to stop it. Ana Ruiz performed surgery while running. A young builder soldier had taken a wound that would kill him in minutes. She cut, stitched, and injected medication without breaking stride. The builder survived. 3 more soldiers fell, covering their retreat. Yuki Tanaka had abandoned any pretense of pilot duties. Her rifle was hot from constant firing. She stood at every corner, every doorway, every choke point, buying time for the others to advance. She had been shot twice. She did not stop. Ryla moved through spaces too small for humans, scouting ahead and reporting enemy positions. Her single remaining arm ached from the strain of crawling through ventilation shafts, but she kept going. She had watched her people die for 10,000 years because they were afraid to fight. She would not be afraid anymore. Counselor Meth led a team of builder engineers who knew the ancient technology. They bypassed security systems and opened sealed doors, guiding the assault force toward their objective. Every step brought them closer to the heart of his people's greatest shame. They reached the control center 2 hours after landing. 500 soldiers had started the final push. Less than 100 remained. Dr. Sarah Bell examined the control interface while Benny's team held the entrance. The ancient systems were still functional, waiting for someone to use them. The activation sequence was simple. The price was not. The origin point could reverse the swarm plague, restore the harmonious to their original state. But it required biological input from a species that had evolved under extreme conditions. A deathworlder, and the operator would not survive. Counselor Meth stepped forward. His people had created this nightmare. It was fitting that one of them should end it. But Sarah stopped him. The builders had not evolved on a harsh world. Their biology would not interface properly with the controls. The activation would fail. IT had to be a human. The remaining soldiers looked at each other. They all knew what this meant. They all volunteered anyway. Benny stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He was tired. He had been tired since Lagos, since the water wars, since the first friend he buried as a child. He had spent his entire life surviving. Maybe it was time to do something more. He thought about his home. He thought about the people he had saved on New Brisbane, the soldiers he had trained, the aliens who had become friends. He thought about what it meant to be human, to come from a world that tried to kill you every day, to learn kindness instead of cruelty, to protect instead of destroy. He sat down at the controls. Sarah showed him the activation sequence. It was simple. 3 commands, entered in order. The origin point would do the rest. Benny entered the first command. Energy began building throughout the structure, but he entered the second command. The swarm creatures attacking the control center stopped moving, as if sensing what was about to happen. He thought about Earth. He thought about Lagos after the restoration, green and alive and full of children who would never know war. He thought about the galaxy, all those worlds that would survive because of what happened here today. He entered the third command. Light filled the universe. The pulse spread outward from the origin point at impossible speed, touching every swarm creature in existence. It did not destroy them. It healed them. Billions of years of plague and hunger and madness washed away in an instant. The swarm remembered who they had been. The harmonious had returned. Benny opened his eyes. He was still alive. The origin point had been designed to protect its operator. The ancients who built it had hoped someone would have the courage to use it. They had made sure that person would survive. He stood up slowly, every bone aching. Around him, the former swarm creatures had stopped attacking. They stood in confusion, looking at their bodies, at the destruction they had caused, at the soldiers who had come to save them. One of them approached Benny. It was massive, twice his height, with mandibles that could crush steel. It lowered itself to the ground and made a sound he did not understand. Sarah translated. It was apologizing. 1 year later, the galaxy had changed. The harmonious had rejoined galactic civilization, carrying deep shame for what they had done while sick. They dedicated themselves to rebuilding what they had destroyed. The Shimmer homeworld would take centuries to restore, but they had time. Humans were no longer seen as primitive deathworlders. They were teachers, protectors, and friends. Earth became a training ground for species who wanted to learn courage. Ryla became head of the Galactic Council. Her first act was to reclassify Earth. It was no longer listed as a death world. Its official designation was now the Cradle of Protectors. Benny Okafor received medals he did not want and gave speeches he hated. But when young soldiers from 100 species asked him what made humans special, he always gave the same answer. Humans came from a world that tried to kill them. Instead of becoming monsters, they became guardians. They survived not by being the strongest, but by refusing to leave anyone behind. The galaxy had never expected that, but perhaps it should have.